The snow came down sideways along County Route 41, driven hard by wind that cut through the Upper Peninsula like a blade. It was the kind of storm locals warned about, but outsiders underestimated the kind that swallowed headlights, erased tire tracks, and turned familiar roads into corridors of white uncertainty. That was when Ethan Rourke noticed it. Not a car, not a deer, not debris blown loose from the trees. Something upright, moving, slowly, against the wind. He eased his truck off the accelerator, heart tightening as his high beams caught the wrong shape in the snow. A woman on crutches, one leg moving stiffly, the other mechanical. Beside her, close enough to brush her coat, walked a large dog, black and tan, head low, body angled protectively, trained but tense. No gloves, no way for help, just forward motion, step after deliberate step, as if stopping wasn't an option anymore. Ethan pulled over without thinking, tires crunching into the shoulder. For a moment, he stayed inside the cab, watching through the windshield as the wind tried to knock her sideways and failed. People didn't walk roads like this unless something had already gone very wrong. Statistically, in storms like this, exposure could turn dangerous in under 30 minutes. Hypothermia didn't announce itself with drama. It crept in quietly: confusion, slowed movement, bad decisions. The dog glanced toward the truck, but didn't bark, didn't retreat either. That told Ethan more than words could. He stepped out into the storm, cold biting his face, boots sinking into fresh snow, and kept his hands visible as he spoke. Calm, even, no urgency that might sound like pressure. "You're miles from town," he said, "and the weather's getting worse. You don't have to explain anything, just ride with me." She studied him through lashes wet with melting snow, jaw set, eyes sharp despite the cold. People like her had learned what help sometimes cost. The dog shifted, placing itself between them without aggression, just warning. Seconds stretched. Wind roared through the pines. Finally, she nodded once, not surrender, but calculation. Survival making the decision pride wouldn't. Ethan helped her into the passenger seat with careful distance, opened the back for the tea, and climbed in without another word. As the heater kicked on and the truck rolled forward, the storm closed in behind them, erasing the place where she'd been walking alone. There are moments like this that don't announce their importance until much later. Moments where the world seems to pause, offering a choice so small it feels ordinary: stop or keep driving, open a door or don't. Most of us believe miracles arrive loud and unmistakable. But out here, in places where help is scarce and nights are long, they often look like a stranger noticing what doesn't belong and deciding not to look away. As the road disappeared into white ahead of them, neither of them knew yet that this wasn't just a rescue from the cold. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would force both of them to confront the storms they had been carrying long before the snow ever started to fall. Ethan Rourke hadn't always been the kind of man who noticed people on the side of the road. There was a time when his world had been narrower and sharper, defined by objectives, extraction points, and the difference between friendly and hostile terrain. For nearly 15 years, that way of thinking had kept him alive. He had served in places most Americans only saw in brief clips on the evening news: dust-choked valleys, concrete cities hollowed out by war, nights where silence was never empty and daylight offered no relief. He learned how to move without being seen, how to make decisions under pressure, how to carry the weight of responsibility without letting it show. By the time he left the service, he was good at surviving almost anything except what came after. The transition home didn't break him all at once. It wore him down quietly. At first, it was the small things: sleeping with his boots by the bed, waking at the slightest noise, keeping his back to the wall in diners without realizing why. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, nearly 1 in 5 combat veterans experience symptoms of PTSD. Ethan never needed the statistic to know he was one of them. He felt it every night when sleep refused to come, every morning when the world felt just a little too loud, a little too close. He tried to hold it together the way he always had: discipline, routine, silence. That strategy worked in combat. At home, it slowly hollowed him out. The losses followed. His marriage didn't survive the distance or the man he became after coming back. His wife used to say he was there physically but never really arrived. When the divorce papers came, he signed them without argument, convinced that restraint was a form of strength. Work was next. The skills that made him invaluable overseas didn't translate cleanly into civilian life. Employers wanted adaptability, teamwork, soft edges. Ethan brought precision, vigilance, and an intensity that made people uneasy. He bounced between security jobs, short contracts, warehouse work that paid the bills but fed nothing inside him. When a back injury led to prescription painkillers, and the painkillers led to drinking, the slide accelerated. Within 2 years, his savings were gone. His house followed. What remained fit into the back of a truck. That was how he ended up in the Upper Peninsula, staying in a weathered trailer he'd bought cheap from a man who didn't ask questions. The land was remote enough to breathe in, quiet enough to let his thoughts stretch out without colliding with other people's expectations. But isolation cuts both ways. Without structure, days blurred. He drank less than he used to, but more than he admitted. Some mornings he sat in his truck, longer than necessary, hands on the wheel, staring at nothing, waiting for the surge of panic to pass before he trusted himself to move. Still, certain instincts never left him. He scanned mirrors automatically. He noticed details others missed: fresh tire tracks, broken branches, the absence of normal sounds. On that road, in that storm, noticing the woman hadn't been heroism. It had been conditioning. People didn't walk into whiteout conditions unless they were desperate, lost, or running from something worse. Ethan understood all three. He had been each of them at different points in his life. As he drove with the heater blasting and the storm hammering the windshield, Ethan kept his eyes on the road, but his awareness widened, cataloging small signs without judgment. The way the woman held herself, conserving energy, the dog's posture protective but controlled, not feral. This wasn't recklessness, it was necessity. He knew the look of someone who had already done the math and decided the odds didn't matter anymore. He had worn that expression himself, standing on rooftops half a world away, weighing whether survival was a goal or just a byproduct of the mission. What Ethan didn't know yet was why this moment felt different. He had passed stranded motorists before. He had helped without staying. But something about this encounter slowed him down internally, forced him to stay present. Maybe it was the way she hadn't asked for help. Maybe it was the bomb or the reminder that survival doesn't always look dramatic. It often looks quiet and stubborn and exhausted. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe after years of losing pieces of himself without protest, he recognized the cost of being unseen. The road ahead narrowed as the storm thickened, trees leaning inward like witnesses. Ethan adjusted his speed, grounded by the rhythm of tires on snow. He didn't offer reassurances. He didn't ask questions yet. Some stories needed warmth before they could be told. What mattered was motion forward, steady, deliberate. The kind that said, "For now, you're not alone." And as the truck pressed deeper into the white, Ethan Rourke, a man who had survived war only to lose everything at home, began to sense that this night was not another test of endurance. It was a turning point, one that would force him to decide whether survival was all he wanted anymore, or whether, for the first time in a long while, he was ready to choose something more. Her name, when she finally offered it, came quietly, as if she were testing whether it was still safe to say out loud. Mara Vance. She didn't volunteer anything else at first. Not where she was going, not where she'd come from. People who learned early that explanations could be twisted against them tended to ration the truth. Ethan understood that instinct. He let the silence do its work, the heater humming, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the snow. When she shifted in the seat, he caught a glimpse of the prosthetic beneath her coat, carbon fiber and metal. Practical, well used. Not new, not ornamental. This was something she had learned to live with, not something she wanted sympathy for. Mara was 29, though the years had landed on her unevenly. Her face still carried traces of softness, but exhaustion had sharpened her features, etched faint lines around eyes that never fully relaxed. Her hands bore small scars, burns, nicks, the kind you earned working with machinery, not the kind you picked up in an office. Before everything changed, she'd worked at a regional distribution warehouse outside Milwaukee, a place that moved fast, cut corners, and quietly discouraged questions. The explosion that took her leg wasn't supposed to happen, a gas line mislabeled, a safety inspection skipped, an emergency shutoff that didn't engage. In the weeks after, investigators called it an accident. The company called it unavoidable. Mara called it something else, though she learned quickly that saying so out loud came with consequences. Recovery was brutal, not just physically. Statistically, workplace accidents involving severe injury often lead to long-term unemployment, especially when litigation is involved. Mara lived that reality. Surgeries piled up, insurance stalled. The lawsuit dragged on, grinding forward inch by inch while her savings evaporated. She watched coworkers who testified quietly disappear from her life, not out of cruelty, but fear. Bills arrived with clinical indifference. Letters from lawyers replaced letters from friends. And then there was the noise online comments, anonymous messages, people who had never met her deciding she was exaggerating, lying, chasing a payout. It's easier to doubt a stranger than to accept that systems fail. Easier to blame an individual than to confront institutional negligence. The dog had come later. Briggs, officially a retired K9 from a private security firm, unofficially the one constant that didn't ask her to justify herself. He'd belonged to a friend who didn't survive the same blast that injured her. When no one else knew what to do with a large, highly trained dog, Mara stepped in. Briggs adapted to her the way he'd been trained to adapt to threat quietly, completely. He learned her pace, her balance, her limits. He learned when to brace and when to move ahead. In public, people noticed the dog before they noticed her, and that suited her just fine. Attention had a way of turning sharp. By the time Mara left the city, she wasn't chasing a fresh start. She was retreating. After a court filing leaked online, her address followed. Then came the notes on her door. Nothing explicit enough for police to act on. Just enough to make it clear she was being watched. Friends suggested she lay low. Lawyers advised patience. Neither offered safety. She packed what she could carry, loaded Briggs into a borrowed car, and drove north until the roads thinned and the air grew colder. Cold, at least, was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything else. The storm had caught her faster than expected. Weather forecasts are good until they're not, and by the time visibility dropped, she was already committed to the road. The car overheated and died just miles from where Ethan found her. Her phone lost power soon after. She weighed her options the way she'd learned to do since the accident, quickly, pragmatically, without sentiment. Stay with the car and risk freezing. Walk and risk worse. She chose movement. People often underestimate how far someone will go when standing still feels more dangerous. As the truck rolled on, Mara's breath steadied, but her shoulders stayed tense, as if waiting for the cost of warmth to reveal itself. She watched Ethan out of the corner of her eye, cataloging details the way Briggs did, the absence of probing questions, the way he didn't flinch when she shifted awkwardly, the fact that he hadn't asked why she was alone. Those omissions mattered. They suggested boundaries, respect, maybe even experience with loss that didn't need translating. What she carried wasn't just the weight of her bag or the ache in her residual limb. It was the constant calculation, the vigilance that came from knowing how quickly life could turn hostile. It was anger, carefully managed, and grief without a clean place to land. It was the knowledge that doing the right thing didn't always lead to protection, and that sometimes survival meant disappearing before someone else decided to erase you first. Outside, the storm pressed closer, but inside the cab, something subtle shifted. Not trust, not yet, but a pause in the constant forward lean of escape. The road ahead remained uncertain, swallowed by snow and night, but for the first time in weeks, Mara wasn't navigating it entirely on her own. And as the miles passed, the space between rescuer and stranger narrowed, setting the stage for truths neither of them had planned to share, and choices that would soon demand more than endurance. The truck moved steadily through the storm, tires whispering against packed snow, the world outside reduced to shifting white and shadow. For several miles, neither of them spoke. Silence, in situations like this, wasn't empty. It was diagnostic. Ethan let it stretch, giving Mara space to decide what kind of quiet this would be, the kind that threatened or the kind that held. He kept his eyes forward, posture relaxed but alert, hands steady on the wheel. People talked when they felt safe enough to risk being understood. Until then, survival came first. Mara broke the silence without turning toward him, "If you stop anywhere public," she said, voice controlled but tight, "I'm not getting out." It wasn't a request. It was a boundary. Ethan nodded once. "Wasn't planning to," he replied. No follow-up, no demand for justification. That mattered more than reassurance ever could. She exhaled slowly, as if setting something heavy down, just a fraction. After another stretch of road, Ethan spoke again, carefully. "Is someone looking for you?" He asked it the way he'd learned to ask questions that mattered, direct, without accusation. Mara's jaw tightened. Her fingers curled briefly into the fabric of her coat. "Maybe," she said. Then after a beat, "Enough that I didn't want to stay still." Ethan absorbed that. In his world, movement was often the only answer when certainty disappeared. He understood the calculus. Danger you can see versus danger you can't. She told him pieces, not the whole thing. How the accident changed more than her body. How people who had promised support vanished when things became inconvenient. How systems designed to protect workers sometimes protected themselves instead. According to national labor data, severe workplace injuries often result in years of legal battles, lost income, and social isolation. Mara didn't quote statistics, but she lived them. She talked about letters that came without warning, about strangers online who decided her pain was negotiable, about how every interaction began to feel like an interrogation. What happened? What did you do wrong? Why didn't you notice sooner? Over time, explaining yourself becomes a kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. Ethan listened without interrupting, jaw set, knuckles whitening briefly on the steering wheel before he forced his grip to loosen. "Sounds like you survived something people wanted to simplify," he said. Mara glanced at him then, surprised. Most people tried to make her story smaller, easier to digest. His words did the opposite. They left room for complexity. She nodded once. "That's one way to put it." She asked about him next, cautiously. Not his job, not his past in detail. Just, "You live out here alone?" Ethan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "For now," he said. He told her about the transition home without dressing it up. About nights where his body reacted before his mind could catch up. About losing things in stages: first sleep, then patience, then people. Veterans returning from combat often struggle not because they're weak, but because the skills that kept them alive don't translate cleanly into ordinary life. Hypervigilance doesn't turn off on command. Neither does guilt. Ethan didn't use clinical language. He didn't need to. Mara recognized the shape of what he was describing. "Different kind of survival," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Same cost," he replied. They sat with that for a moment, the truth of it settling between them. Survival, whether from war or disaster, demanded adaptation. But adaptation often came at the expense of connection. You learned how to keep going, you forgot how to arrive. Briggs shifted in the back seat, nails clicking softly, sensing the change in tone. Mara reached back instinctively, fingers brushing his fur. The dog leaned into the touch, grounding her. Ethan noticed. Companionship without conditions. He understood the appeal. Out here, trust wasn't built through declarations. It was built through consistency, steady driving, warm air, questions that respected boundaries. "I didn't want help," Mara said after a while. "Out there, I didn't want to owe anyone anything." Ethan nodded again. "Needing help isn't the same as owing," he said. "Sometimes it's just choosing not to freeze." She considered that. The idea unsettled her, but it didn't feel false. Too many people had framed help as leverage. He was framing it as logistics. The storm intensified, wind rocking the truck slightly. Ethan adjusted without comment, slowing just enough to maintain control. Outside, the world remained hostile and unyielding. Inside, something quieter was happening. Two people, each trained by experience to endure alone, were comparing notes without trying to fix each other. There was no promise in it, no romance yet, just recognition. The understanding that survival took many forms, and that sometimes the most radical act wasn't pushing forward, but allowing someone else to share the road for a while. Ahead, faint shapes emerged through the snow, the suggestion of structures, the promise of shelter. Ethan glanced at the fuel gauge, then at the road. "We're almost there," he said, voice steady. Mara didn't ask where. For the moment, knowing that there was a there was enough. As the truck pressed on, carrying two stories shaped by different battles, but bound by the same resolve, the confessional of the road gave way to something else, the first fragile sense that endurance might not be the only option left. The place Ethan brought her to wasn't a cabin or a house, not even something most people would recognize as shelter. It was an old Forestry Service outpost set back from the road, a low concrete structure with a corrugated metal roof and windows reinforced decades ago against storms that came harder and more often than they do now. It had been decommissioned years earlier, but the lock still worked, the generator still coughed to life, and the walls were thick enough to hold heat if you were patient. From the outside, it looked forgotten. From the outside, it felt exposed in a different way, too quiet, too still, like a place that remembered every sound ever made inside it. Ethan parked with the nose of the truck angled away from the road. Habit more than strategy. He killed the engine and waited a beat before moving, listening. Wind, snow ticking against metal. Nothing else. He got out first, boots crunching, and scanned the perimeter automatically. Mara noticed. She also noticed that he didn't tell her to hurry, didn't grab her arm, didn't rush the dog. Trauma, she'd learned, flared fastest when someone else decided your pace. She lowered herself carefully, crutches biting into packed snow, Briggs stepping in sync with her movements, body angled just enough to brace without crowding. Inside, the cold had a weight to it, the kind that settled into concrete and refused to leave quickly. Ethan flipped a switch and overhead lights flickered on, buzzing faintly before stabilizing. The sound made Mara flinch before she could stop herself. Her shoulders tensed, breath hitching just enough to notice. Ethan saw it and reached up, switching the light off again. "Lamp's quieter, Vaughn," he said, crossing to a battered desk where an old camping lantern waited. No commentary, no apology, just adjustment. It was a small thing, but small things were often the difference between tolerable and unbearable. He moved methodically, lighting a propane heater, setting water to warm, laying out blankets that smelled faintly of dust and pine cleaner. The space filled slowly with heat and shadow, corners softening as the temperature rose. Still, safety didn't arrive all at once. Shelter, Mara knew, was not the same as peace. The body didn't care about locked doors when memory was louder. Her residual limb began to ache, a deep, familiar throb triggered by cold and stress. She shifted, jaw tight, determined not to draw attention to it. Pain was easier to manage when it stayed private. Briggs paced once, twice, then settled near the door, back to the wall, eyes tracking every movement. His presence steadied her, but it also sharpened her awareness. Dogs trained like him read threat everywhere. They didn't relax because someone said it was safe. They relaxed when the environment proved it over time. Mara realized she was no different. Ethan sat across the room, not crowding her space, shoulders angled away in a posture that signaled neutrality. He poured hot water into two mismatched mugs, slid one toward her without crossing the invisible line she'd drawn. "It's just water," he said, didn't want to assume. Assumptions had gotten her hurt before. She nodded, wrapped her hands around the mug, and let the warmth seep into her fingers. Her hands were still trembling slightly. She hated that. According to trauma research, the body often stays in fight or flight long after the danger passes. Knowing that didn't make the shaking stop, but it kept her from blaming herself for it. The outpost creaked as wind pressed against it, metal groaning softly. The sound sent a jolt through Ethan, sharp and immediate. His jaw clenched. For a split second, the room shifted, overlaying itself with another place, another noise. He closed his eyes, grounded himself the way he'd been taught. Name 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear. When he opened them again, Mara was watching him, not with fear, but recognition. Different triggers, same response. "Sorry," he said automatically, then stopped himself. Apologies, he'd learned, were often used to smooth over discomfort rather than address it. "It'll pass," he corrected. Mara nodded. She didn't tell him not to apologize. She didn't tell him she understood. Some truths didn't need to be spoken to be shared. Minutes passed, then more. Heat built. The storm raged outside, but the interior settled into a fragile equilibrium. This was the part no one talked about, the in-between. The place where you weren't in immediate danger anymore, but your nervous system hadn't gotten the memo. People expected gratitude, relief, even calm. Instead, what often surfaced was irritability, vigilance, a sudden urge to leave. Safe spaces could feel threatening when you'd learn to associate stillness with vulnerability. "I won't stay long," Mara said eventually, voice measured, "just until the road's clear." It was a boundary, not a rejection. Ethan accepted it as such. "That's fine," he replied. "We'll take it 1 hour at a time." He didn't offer plans beyond that. Planning implied certainty. Certainty was fragile. Later, as water heated and the heater hummed, Ethan reached into a crate and pulled out a single candle, bent and half-used. "I heard you say it was an anniversary," he said, eyes on the flame as he lit it. "Not a celebration, a marker. In trauma-informed care, acknowledging time and loss mattered. Ignoring it didn't make it disappear." The candle flickered, casting soft light across the concrete walls. Mara stared at it longer than she meant to. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Tears required safety, too. They didn't talk much after that. Words had done enough work for one night. Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent and relentless. Inside, two people learned the shape of a shared space without claiming it. Boundaries held. Triggers surfaced and were met with quiet adjustments instead of panic or control. It wasn't peace, it wasn't home, but it was functional, and sometimes functional was the first step toward healing. As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of easing, both of them understood something without naming it. Shelter could keep the cold out, but it couldn't keep the past from knocking. What mattered was how you answered when it did, and whether you faced it alone or with someone willing to stay present through the discomfort. In the hours ahead, that question would grow sharper, demanding more than endurance, more than courtesy. It would demand choice. The reveal didn't come all at once. It never does. Truth, when it's dangerous, tends to surface in fragments, testing the ground before it shows itself fully. The storm outside had settled into a steady, relentless rhythm, the kind that made time feel suspended. Inside the outpost, the candle had burned low, wax pooling at its base. Mara sat with her hands wrapped around the mug long after the water had gone lukewarm, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Ethan waited. He had learned the hard way that forcing a confession only taught people to hide better. "It wasn't just an accident," she said finally, voice quiet but firm. Not dramatic, not pleading, a statement of fact. Ethan didn't react. He didn't lean forward or ask her to continue. He simply nodded, signaling he was listening. That restraint gave her room to breathe. She told him how months after the explosion, a former coworker had reached out late one night, voice shaking, asking if she still had access to the maintenance logs. How he'd hinted carefully that the line which ruptured had been flagged weeks earlier, that the inspection report filed afterward didn't match what they'd actually seen, how certain signatures appeared where they shouldn't have, how timestamps didn't line up. At first, Mara thought it was grief talking, paranoia fueled by pain. But patterns have a way of asserting themselves when you look long enough. She described the moment it shifted from suspicion to certainty, a file misfiled in a shared drive, a version history that hadn't been scrubbed properly, an email chain that stopped one message too soon. Nothing cinematic, just evidence of shortcuts taken, warnings ignored, and a decision made that saving time and money mattered more than human cost. According to federal safety data, preventable industrial accidents account for thousands of serious injuries every year. Investigations often stall not because facts are unclear, but because responsibility is diffuse. Mara found the thread that tied it together. And once you see a thread like that, you can't unsee it. "I thought if I handed it over, it would be enough," she said. "That truth would protect itself." Her mouth tightened. "I was wrong." The lawyer she trusted advised caution. The agency promised review. Meanwhile, the pressure began. Subtle at first, a cease and desist letter referencing defamation, a warning about violating confidentiality agreements. Then the anonymous messages escalated. "You don't want to make this worse. Think about your future." One message included a photo of her building taken from across the street. That was when she stopped sleeping altogether. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. He recognized the tactic. In conflict zones, intimidation worked best when it stayed just this side of overt threat, enough to unsettle, not enough to provoke immediate action. You ran because staying put made you predictable, he said. Mara looked at him sharply. He met her gaze without flinching. I've seen it before, he added. She nodded slowly. Being understood without being interrogated was a rare relief. She explained why she hadn't gone to the police, why she hadn't trusted the process anymore. Whistleblower protections existed on paper, but in practice they were patchwork and slow. Careers ended quietly, cases dragged on for years. In the meantime, people got isolated, harassed, disappeared into the margins of their own lives. Mara wasn't trying to be brave. She was trying to stay alive long enough for the truth to matter. Briggs lifted his head, ears pricked, as if sensing the tension. Mara rested a hand on his neck, grounding herself. I took copies, she said. Encrypted, multiple locations. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, prepared. I didn't know what I'd do with them, she continued. I just knew I couldn't leave them behind. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her shoulders. Carrying evidence meant carrying risk. Every mile she traveled north was both escape and exposure. Ethan stood and crossed the room slowly, stopping well short of her space. He looked down at the candle, now little more than a stub. You did what people do when systems fail them, he said. You adapted. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. He'd made similar choices under different circumstances, choosing imperfect options when perfect ones didn't exist. He also knew the cost. Living in motion eroded trust. It frayed nerves. It made you mistake safety for entrapment. What I don't know, Mara said quietly, is who else knows. That was the part that scared her most. Information had a way of traveling. Secrets leaked, lines blurred. She had seen how quickly narratives could be flipped, how victims could be recast as liabilities. Running bought her time, not resolution. The outpost hummed with the sound of the heater, the only constant in a night full of unknowns. Ethan understood now why this encounter felt heavier than coincidence. This wasn't just about weather or chance. It was about what happened when ordinary people stumbled into extraordinary responsibility. The midpoint had been reached. The line crossed from survival into consequence. What Mara carried wasn't only her past. It was the truth, inconvenient and dangerous, demanding a decision neither of them could postpone much longer. And as the storm continued to close in, both of them sensed that staying neutral was no longer an option. The knock came just after dawn, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the thin quiet the storm had finally allowed. Briggs was on his feet instantly, a low warning vibrating in his chest. Ethan froze for half a second, every instinct flaring. The outpost wasn't supposed to be on anyone's route. He moved without thinking, hand lifting in a subtle signal for Mara to stay back, then crossed the room with measured steps. When he opened the door, cold air rushed in, and with it, a face he hadn't seen in years. Daniel Rourke stood on the threshold, older and thinner than Ethan remembered. His coat too light for the weather, eyes rimmed red from more than lack of sleep. His older brother had always been the one who stayed behind while Ethan left first for training, then for deployments, then for a life that never really came back home. Daniel had aged hard in Ethan's absence, years of bad decisions etched into the lines around his mouth. He didn't waste time on greetings. I need help, he said, voice raw, and you're the only one I can ask. The words landed heavy. Family had a way of bypassing defenses that nothing else could. Ethan stepped outside, closing the door behind him, containing the moment before it spilled into the space Mara occupied. Snow crunched underfoot as Daniel spoke quickly, nervously, explaining an half-truth in fragments. He owed money, not the kind you could negotiate down. He'd taken a job that turned out to be dirtier than advertised moving equipment, no questions asked. When he tried to walk away, the threats started. Names were dropped, addresses mentioned, people who knew where he'd grown up, who his brother was. Ethan listened, jaw tight. He'd heard this story before, dressed in different uniforms. Pressure, leverage, the illusion of choice. Daniel's voice broke when he mentioned Ethan's service, the reputation that still clung to him. They said you'd understand, he said, that you know how to handle things. Translation: They wanted Ethan back in the role he'd been trying to leave behind. The fixer, the man who stepped into shadows so others didn't have to. Inside, Mara watched through the reinforced window, heart sinking as recognition set in. She didn't know the man at the door, but she knew the posture of someone carrying history. She also knew what it meant when the past showed up uninvited. Briggs paced once, sensing her tension. The safety of the outpost felt thinner now, as if the walls themselves had learned how fragile boundaries could be. Ethan felt the pull acutely. Helping his brother would be familiar. It would be decisive, immediate, and dangerous in ways he understood. It would also drag him back into a world where moral lines blurred and survival justified almost anything. He thought of the years it had taken to crawl out of that mindset, thought of the cost. "I can't do that," he said finally. The words surprised even him. Daniel stared, disbelief flashing across his face. "You always could before," he said. Ethan shook his head. "That was before I lost everything." Daniel's gaze flicked past him toward the door. "You got someone inside?" he asked, suspicion creeping in. Ethan's shoulders squared. "That's not your concern," he replied. The boundary was clear, non-negotiable. Daniel's expression hardened, hurt and anger mixing. "So that's it?" he demanded. "You're just going to turn your back?" Ethan held his ground. "I'm choosing not to make it worse," he said quietly. Sometimes the hardest loyalty was refusing to enable destruction. Daniel left without another word, boots crunching away into the snow, his silhouette swallowed by white and distance. Ethan stood there long after he was gone, breath visible in the cold, hands clenched at his sides. When he went back inside, Mara didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The air between them had changed. The past had come calling, and Ethan had answered differently than before, but choices had consequences. As the door shut and the generator hummed on, both of them understood that staying neutral was no longer possible. Forces were converging, her truth, his history, the threat of exposure. The storm outside had passed, but another was gathering, closer now, more personal. And in the quiet that followed, a new question settled in. When pressure came from all sides, would survival mean retreat or standing together in the open? The decision didn't announce itself with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. It arrived quietly, the way most real turning points do, slipping into the space left behind after the past had made its demands and been refused. Ethan closed the door, leaned his forehead briefly against the cool metal, and breathed out. When he turned back into the room, Mara was already gathering her things. Not hurried, methodical, the movements of someone who had learned never to linger once the ground shifted beneath her. "I should go," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Your brother didn't come out here by accident. It wasn't accusation. It was assessment." She knew how patterns worked. People followed threads. And wherever Ethan's past reached, it carried weight and risk she hadn't asked for. Briggs stood immediately, tail low but steady, waiting for her cue. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the old reflex to step in front, to take control, to solve the problem by force of will. He resisted it. "If you leave right now," he said carefully, "you'll be walking back into uncertainty. Same storm, different shape." Mara paused, hands still. "And if I stay," she replied, finally looking at him, "I become something you're responsible for." That was the line she wouldn't cross. Dependence had a way of turning into obligation, then resentment. She had lived that arc too many times. Ethan stepped forward just enough to be seen, not enough to crowd her space. "I'm not offering rescue," he said. "I'm offering alignment." The word landed differently. He explained without overselling it, without promises he couldn't keep. He wouldn't make decisions for her. He wouldn't hide her or fight her battles alone. What he would do was stand beside her while she chose the next move and accept the risks that came with that choice as his own. Partnership wasn't protection, it was consent. Mara studied his face, searching for the familiar signs control disguised as concern, strength leveraged into authority. She didn't find them. Instead, she saw something raw. Fear, yes, but also restraint. According to trauma research, autonomy is one of the first things people lose in crisis, and one of the hardest to reclaim. Ethan wasn't trying to take it from her. He was handing it back. "What does that look like?" she asked quietly. Ethan didn't hesitate. It looks like we stopped running in circles, he said. We call the right people, not friends, not favors. Organizations that know how to handle this without turning it into a spectacle. He talked about legal advocacy groups, whistleblower protections that actually functioned when activated correctly, about documenting threats instead of absorbing them. He didn't present himself as a solution. He presented a framework. Mara felt something in her chest loosen, not relief exactly, but recognition. This was how progress happened. Slowly, transparently, together. She shook her head once, a bitter smile flickering. You know this could cost you whatever piece you've managed to carve out, she said. The words surprised him as much as her. They felt earned. He had spent years shrinking his world to keep it manageable. Maybe that wasn't survival. Maybe it was just delay. Briggs moved between them, then sat, positioning himself squarely but calmly, eyes moving from one face to the other. The gesture wasn't obedience, it was assessment. Animals trained like him didn't choose sides lightly. After a moment, his tail thumped once against the floor. Mara exhaled a soft, humorless laugh. Guess he's voting, she said. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. Trust, apparently, was contagious. She set her bag down again, deliberately. Not surrender, decision. If we do this, she said, we do it clean. No shortcuts, no disappearing. Ethan met her gaze. Agreed. They stood there, the space between them no longer charged with uncertainty, but with intention. This wasn't a promise of safety, it was a commitment to agency. They sat back down at the table, maps and notes spreading out between them. Mara outlined what she had, where it was stored, who might already be compromised. The Ethan listened, asked precise questions, offered options without pushing outcomes. The dynamic shifted subtly. She wasn't a person being sheltered. She was a collaborator. He wasn't a shield. He was a witness with resources. Outside, the sky began to lighten, storm clouds thinning at the edges. Morning didn't erase the danger, but it changed its contours. As the first pale light filtered through reinforced glass, both of them understood the weight of what they'd chosen. Standing still had been dangerous. Running had been exhausting. Real partnership would be neither simple nor safe, but it would be honest. When they finally looked up from the table, Briggs stretched and settled near their feet, satisfied for now. The outpost hummed with quiet purpose. Whatever came next would come quickly. Phone calls, paper trails, pushback. But for the first time since the road disappeared into white, survival was no longer the only goal. They had chosen to move forward not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals. Two people willing to be seen, to share risk, and to face what followed side by side. The days that followed unfolded without spectacle, the way real resolutions usually do. There were no sirens, no public apologies, no instant vindication. Justice, when it comes at all, often arrives wrapped in paperwork and waiting rooms. Ethan and Mara made the calls they had agreed on, starting with organizations that understood how fragile truth could be once it left your hands. An advocacy group connected Mara to legal counsel outside the influence of the company she was challenging. A secure channel was established, evidence was transferred, verified, backed up again. Each step forward brought a corresponding cost time, energy, and the constant hum of anxiety that never fully quieted. The pressure didn't disappear. It changed shape. Letters arrived, this time more carefully worded. Offers were implied, then withdrawn. The kind of silence that followed was almost worse than open hostility. According to national whistleblower data, most cases don't end with dramatic trials. They end with settlements, regulatory actions, and quiet reforms that rarely make headlines. Mara learned to live with that reality. Vindication wasn't a single moment. It was a slow reclamation of credibility, of being taken seriously again. The lawsuit moved. Oversight agencies took notice. An internal review became external. It wasn't everything she'd lost, but it was something. Healing followed a similarly uneven path. Ethan enrolled in a veteran support program he'd avoided for years, uncomfortable with the idea of sitting in a circle and naming things he'd learned to survive by burying. The first meetings were brutal. listening to other men articulate feelings he'd never given language to cracked something open. Progress wasn't linear. Some nights he still woke sweating, heart racing, but he learned tools grounding, accountability, the difference between vigilance and fear. He cut back on drinking, then stopped altogether. The work was humbling. It was also necessary. Survival had kept him alive. Recovery demanded honesty. Mara began rebuilding in smaller, quieter ways. She took on remote contract work design projects that didn't require her to justify her presence or her pace. She adjusted her prosthetic, worked with a physical therapist who treated her like an athlete instead of a liability. There were setbacks, pain flared, doubt resurfaced. Trauma doesn't disappear because circumstances improve. But she noticed changes too. She slept longer, laughed once, then again. The tight calculation that had governed every decision loosened its grip. Briggs thrived in the stability. His routines returned, his posture softened. Animals respond to environments the way people do. Consistency breeds calm. He became a fixture in both their days, a reminder that safety is something you practice, not something you declare. There were losses along the way. Ethan's brother didn't call again. The silence hurt more than the confrontation had. Doing the right thing doesn't guarantee reconciliation. Sometimes it clarifies distance instead. Ethan learned to sit with that grief without trying to fix it. Mara lost acquaintances who found the process inconvenient, uncomfortable. She let them go. Healing required pruning. What neither of them gained was a clean ending. The company never issued a public apology. The system didn't rewrite itself. But there were tangible shifts. Procedures changed. A warning system was updated. Someone else, somewhere down the line, would be safer because she refused to stay quiet. That mattered. Quiet victories often do. One evening, weeks later, they stood outside as the last of the snow receded, earth dark and damp beneath their boots. The air smelled different, less sharp, more open. I used to think doing the right thing meant everything would fall into place afterward, Mara said. Ethan nodded. Turns out it just means you can live with what follows. And they shared a look that held exhaustion and something sturdier beneath it. The cost had been real. Fear, uncertainty, strained ties. But so was the gain. Agency reclaimed, dignity restored. A life no longer organized around escape. As the light faded and Briggs trotted ahead, they understood that justice and healing were not destinations. They were practices, imperfect, ongoing, and worth choosing again each day. And with that understanding came a quieter strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself but holds when tested. They returned to the road weeks later, not because they needed to, but because some places hold meaning until you meet them again on your own terms. The storm had passed, but winter still lingered along the shoulders, snow thinning into patches of dark earth and ice. Mara moved carefully but confidently now, her prosthetic aligned, her stride steadier, Briggs trotting a few steps ahead with the easy certainty of a dog who knows his world is solid again. Ethan walked beside her, not leading, not guarding, simply matching her pace. The road looked ordinary in daylight, no drama, no omen, just asphalt winding through trees that had endured worse and kept standing. Nothing about the world had fundamentally changed. Storms still came without asking. Systems still failed people who trusted them. Pain still resurfaced when least expected. But something essential had shifted. When Mara had walked this road before, she was moving away from danger without knowing where she'd land. Now she stood on it, knowing she could stop, turn back, or move forward by choice. That difference mattered more than distance. Ethan thought about how close he'd come to driving past her that night, about how many times in his life he'd kept moving because stopping felt like risk. He understood now that intervention didn't always mean control. Sometimes it meant attention. According to studies on crisis response, early human connection, simple presence, not solutions, dramatically increases survival and recovery outcomes. He hadn't known the data then. He'd only known what felt wrong and chosen not to ignore it. Mara watched the horizon, breathing in cold air that no longer felt like a threat. She had learned that strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to carry it without letting it dictate every step. Healing hadn't erased what she'd lost. It had given her a way to live with it honestly, Doing the right thing had cost her comfort, certainty, and time. It had given her something quieter in return, self-respect. They stopped for a moment, standing where the snow had once driven sideways and visibility had vanished. Briggs circled back, tail wagging, then sat, content. The image was simple, unremarkable to anyone passing by. And that was the point. Miracles, when they happen, don't always announce themselves with light or noise. Sometimes they look like a stranger noticing what doesn't belong and choosing to stop. The storm hadn't been defeated. It never is. But someone had paused long enough to change the outcome. And in a world that often feels indifferent and relentless, that choice to see, to stay, to share the road was enough. If you've ever been the one walking through the storm or the one who almost drove past, tell us in the comments. Your story might be the one someone else needs tonight.